For this last video before Christmas, I have a slightly controversial opinion. I think there are too many micros. I think there are too many micros. Now that doesn't mean that there's some kind of oversubscribed quota of micros. All it means is I think there are too many people operating as micros when they would actually be better off operating as something else. Now micro can be fantastic, obviously, but it can also hold a lot of people back. So this video, and it probably won't be the only one we make on the subject, is just to highlight some of micro's limitations and see if it's holding you back. Welcome back to this channel. If you've been here before, then you already know that moving on from micro is something we talk about quite often. And if you're starting to nudge up against that turnover ceiling, then you probably already know that your micro is holding you back and you don't need me to tell you that. But that's only one of the ways that your micro could be holding you back, and there are so many more. So let's look at some of the other ones. And just before we do, I'd like to say there are some micros who are very happy to stay at that level just under the turnover ceiling. But if you're here, I'm imagining that you're the kind of micro who wants to grow. So let's see what we can do for you. If you're working regularly, still seeing very little profit, then the very first thing you need to look at is the level of your expenses, which sounds obvious, but this problem can creep up so much more easily than you would think. Now let's take the example of Mrs. A. He has a small commercial micro. So you remember with commercial, the recommended level of expenditure not to exceed before you think about moving on to a different structure is 71% of your turnover. Now Mrs. A has her stock for 60 and she sells it on for 100. She thinks she should be quite comfortable. But let's not forget that URSAF are going to take €12 straight away, which is over a quarter of Mrs. A's profit. Out of her 100, she should now be left with 28 for herself, except she has other expenses. She has rent, she has insurance, she has electricity. Then she has other local expenses that she can't deduct either. She's got marketing, she's got packaging, and I'm not even talking about the VAT she's paying that she's not claiming back. So out of that €28 that's theoretically left to Mrs. A, there's not €28 at all, there's a whole lot less. And if Mrs. A only gets to keep €10 out of every €100 just to clear €1,000 each month, Mrs. A has to invoice €10,000. Mrs. A's micro is holding her back, and if your situation looks anything like Mrs. A's, then your micro is holding you back as well. Now I want to talk about Mr. B. Mr. B has an activity that had very minimal expenses. So he figured that the micro would work really well for him, and actually he was right. But now Mr. B's activity has got to a point where it could expand a lot more and a lot more quickly if he could just invest in it. There are a lot of jobs that Mr. B has to do himself. They take up a lot of his time, and so they rein in a lot of his productivity, and actually somebody else would do them a lot better than he does them. But he's not allowing himself to subcontract that work out because he can't deduct the expenditure. He cannot justify that investment. So what happens is he's having to carry on doing everything himself, and Mr. B's business, and therefore his income, stays smaller than they should be because his micro is holding him back. Are you Mr. B? But now I want to move on to Mrs. C. Mrs. C has a regular job, but she just thought she would set up a micro to make a little bit extra money in her spare time. This is Mrs. C's side hustle. But what's happening is that the micro is not making her any richer because all of the turnover is having to be declared as income, and she already had an income that she was declaring. So now she's raised her income tax liability. She's paying more tax, and any profit that is left over is being eaten into by the social charges and the real expenses that the micro is bringing with it that she can't deduct. And so Mrs. C's side hustle is not making her any money at all. It's holding her back, and it would also hold you back. But now I'm going to introduce you to the D's. Mr. D has a micro that's actually doing really well, actually make more money if he wanted to. And Mrs. D, she does all of Mr. D's admin, she does all of his invoicing, she also does all the other administrative bits and pieces, she does a lot of his networking, she does quite a lot of his marketing, but she's not getting paid for any of it because Mr. D can't deduct her as a salary, obviously. So although Mr. D is making contributions towards his pension and he's validating all of his quarters, Mrs. D is not getting any pension contributions at all. She's working for free, and eventually Mr. and Mrs. D will both suffer from that because their combined pension will be a lot less than it would be if she were making pension contributions as well. Now, in a different structure where Mr. D could legitimately pay Mrs. D a salary and all of her social charges, then they would be a tax-deductible expense for his company. He would be showing less profit and therefore he would be paying lower charges as well. So yes, their micro is holding them back, but I'm going to stick with them for a minute because they actually have another problem. Mr. and Mrs. D would like to be able to put some money aside. They'd like to be able to make some savings, except by the time they've paid all of their real expenses and their tax and social charges, there isn't a lot of money to put aside. If Mrs. D, again, were Mr. D's employee, then they would both have the opportunity to open and contribute to a company savings plan and a company retirement plan. But those are things that the D's don't have any access to because they're in a micro. So I think you can see that this micro is seriously holding them back in more ways than one. And finally, I'd like to talk to you about Miss E. Miss E is single, she has no dependents, she's travelled all over the world, she may not even stay in France long term, she's not sure of that at all. She's got private pension plans, she has a very good mutual, and she doesn't even need all of the money that she's actually invoicing every month. She could quite happily live off a lot less than that, but she's still contributing 20% of all of her turnover into a social system that she may never get any benefit from. Now, if Miss E were in a different company structure, she could be a lot better off. And I think you've guessed that Miss E's micro is holding her back. Now, I could probably carry on and think of another 100 examples like these, but if you've recognized yourself so far and you know that your micro is holding you back, then over the holidays, just give yourself a few minutes to ask yourself, what is stopping you? Is 2024 going to be the year that you give yourself and your business the chance that you deserve? I'm going to wish you all a very Merry Christmas and a very happy, healthy and successful New Year.